All right, we're going to get started here. So up next, we've got Jamie McGuire from High Point Networks. He's going to, during his presentation, the participants will learn what reconnaissance and information gathering means from the perspective of an attacker. He's going to cover specific tools used to automate information gathering, and audience members will leave the presentation with everything they need to know to begin conducting reconnaissance on their own organizations. Are we sure we want them to be able to do that?
Yeah.
I'll leave it to him. James McGuire.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Can everyone hear me okay? Right? I am going for the Taylor Swift look, I guess, but that's okay. I kind of like Taylor Swift. So let's see if this works. A little bit of feedback. Hopefully most of you guys are familiar with us. I'm here with High Point Networks. For anyone who's not familiar with us, maybe for some of the students, right? The easiest way to describe what we do is we help companies buy and use technology. So kind of from that sense, I suppose you could kind of consider us a traditional VAR, right? A value-added reseller. But where we kind of like to differentiate ourselves is we really like to partner with our customers. So in a lot of cases, we can be just a company that you just buy hardware from, whether that's, network gear, firewalls, stuff like that. But some of our best success stories are cases where we've really partnered with businesses when we've kind of freed up IT people to help them do what they do best. We have offices in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, and Colorado. So we're pretty regionally based here, I guess. And we like to consider ourselves engineer heavy. We have more technical people than we do sales people, and that's kind of another point of pride for us. That's how we like it. So what I do at High Point, I kind of get plugged into the services that we have in purple here, specifically vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. So that's going to be kind of where my perspective is coming from, specifically on the penetration testing side. What we're talking about today specifically is the information gathering in the purple. So this is a kind of a basic penetration testing methodology. It's not ours. I just stole this from Google. A lot of other firms probably use something pretty similar. Was anyone in Jason Lang's talk, the red team methodology? A couple nods. Yeah, so Jason kind of sort of compared and contrasted red teaming versus penetration testing. And one of the biggest differences was that time, right? Red team engagements are a lot longer than a penetration test. Typically with a pen test, I get about a week, maybe 2 weeks, depending on scope. And so kind of considering that, I have to try to automate a lot of different phases. So I try to automate as much as possible, automate low-level tasks so that I can kind of focus on the really important stuff, report writing and generating valuable findings. So kind of tying that back into information gathering, we're going to kind of go through some of the tools and techniques to do that. I'll show that stuff to you guys. Most of the tools are going to be open source, meaning they're free. And I kind of hope that you guys see by the end of that a lot of this stuff really isn't that hard. It's pretty easy to get up and going. And furthermore, a lot of the stuff we're going to look at, it's all considered publicly available. So sometimes when people conduct their information gathering, they might include scanning with that. And that's something that I try to stay away from. And the reason for that is if I don't do any port scanning, I like to conduct all of my information gathering without actually touching the target's environment. I might browse the target's website a little bit, but beyond that, I'm not going to scan hosts. I'm not going to start scanning servers and crawling them and stuff like that. I'm going to try to stay hands-off on the environment as much as I can. And that way, I can kind of cheat a little bit. I like to try to do some of this even before we have our ethical hacking agreement signed. And that's just a way to protect myself. So if you've ever done a pen test or you're a pen tester, it's a pretty common thing in the industry to have a signed ethical hacking agreement, right? And that just protects me. So if things go south, then I have this legal document that I can fall back on. But with my information gathering, if I'm only using publicly available data, if I'm not really hammering on any servers, not even doing any port scanning, then all of this activity is really legal. And I can do that even before I have my documents signed. The last point I wanted to make, sometimes this is skipped. I've seen that before too. And I used to be really guilty of this kind of thing too. So starting out, I used to just jump right into port scanning because that's where the interesting stuff is, right? I would get my document signed and just jump right into scanning. And then maybe I would find something interesting. I find an interface that I want to perform password guessing against, or I want to brute force. Well, now I need to figure out what usernames are. And then I'm kind of back and trying to figure out names of people and how their usernames are set up, and then I can do my password guessing. So from the tester's perspective, it really behooves you to kind of follow this methodology, and the information you gather at each step kind of feeds you into the next step. So what information would we like to know at a high level? I'd really like to know the names, first and last names of employees. I'd like to know who works there. And if I can figure that out, now I can start to generate lists of email addresses and potentially usernames if I can figure out the scheme that those are formatted in. And usually it's first name dot last name, not always, but you know that's what I come across, or first initial last name. And that's not every case, but that's pretty common. Other things I'd like to know, client-side software. I want to know, I'd like to know specifically what software people are using, what are they interacting with, and this might lead me to email phishing. So if I know that perhaps this organization is using an outdated version of Microsoft Office, maybe there's an exploit for Word that I can use, and I can send them a rigged phishing attachment. That might work. Other than that, I'd like to know what other specific technologies are in use, right? I'd like to know email filtering. I'd like to know antivirus. I'd like to know firewalls. All of that is just going to help me kind of piece together what the target environment is going to look like. And that's what a lot of this information gathering really is. It's, at this point, we're really just kind of trying to size up the environment. That's what we're after. So where are we going to get our information? Like I mentioned, the target's website can be extremely useful. We'll see an example of that, how we can gather some information and scrape names out of there. We can look for documents, right? So maybe if we can find some PDFs, some spreadsheets, maybe we can analyze the metadata inside those environments and lift valuable information out of those. Other places, LinkedIn and other social media. Weston and both Jason have already kind of touched on this. LinkedIn is a really valuable source for gathering names at least, and we'll kind of see what that looks like. I like to look at job postings if they're available as well. Those can have some interesting information in them. Search engines, we'll take a look at Google, and we'll also look at my favorite search engine, Shodan, to kind of see what that looks like. And then we can take a look at data breaches too. At this point, a lot of data breach available is publicly available. It might not be very easy to find, but you know, by spending a couple minutes on Google, you can find yourself a copy of the LinkedIn data breach. And so that's something that I'll like to look through for credentials. So this is an example quick. We'll take a look at a target's website and see how we can scrape some names out of it. These are all videos that I had recorded ahead of time. Before I play this, like one thing, so the website we're going to look at, this is a customer of ours. So not to like rip on them, because they're a really cool company and we have a good relationship with them. I just happen to know that they have their website configured in such a way that it has kind of an employee directory on that. And if that's right out on the internet, well now we can pretty quickly get everyone's names out of it. So we can kind of see what that looks like. And it looks like it's going to play. So we'll just go right to their website. In this case, it's BNG Team. And again, not to single these guys out, I just know that they happen to have their website set up in this way. And so if we go to their website here and we're scrolling around, we see that they have this link, view all team members. And that's awesome for an attacker because now we can go right here and we can see we have everyone's name, title, and like a headshot. So that's pretty cool. So taking a look at that, what I like to do is I'm just right-clicking and viewing the page source. And this is going to show me the HTML that makes up the page. And what I'm looking for here is I want to see how those names are formatted on this web page. And so I'm kind of scrolling through all the HTML, and here you can see I found it. So it might be kind of hard to see, but all of the names are wrapped in an H4 HTML tag, or for heading 4. So the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to copy that link, go over to a command prompt, and just download a copy of that web page using wget. And that's going to download a copy of that exact web page. Takes a little bit, and if I take a look at that, now I have a copy of that web page. If I just try to read the web page as it is, it's going to be all that code again, right? So now I need to kind of parse out all of those names, and to do that, I'm going to use grep. And so if I just grep for that H4 tag, you can see I got the list of names, but the format isn't great, right? It needs to be cleaned up a little bit, but I can keep using command line arguments. In this case, I'm going to pipe everything into sed and try to clean up all those blank spaces. And it takes me a little bit to type it out here. So we'll take a look. This is all on Linux, again, by the way. So kind of, we're looking at a Ubuntu VM that I have. And there you can see, by piping that into sed with a couple more arguments, I cleaned out all that white space. So the next thing I have to clean out now are those H4 tags, or those heading 4 tags. And I'm just going to use sed again for that because, I don't know, it's simple, and I know that it's going to work. So I'll do that. There I stripped out the first heading 4 tag. And now I'm going to strip out the last one here by using sed again. And this will take a little bit. I guess I felt like this was faster when I watched it earlier. Up here, it feels like it's moving very, very slowly. So there you can see now, I have a really nice convenient list of everyone's names. And I'm just going to take that big bash one-liner and just output it to a file called first.last, or first_last.txt. And now I have a nice list of everyone's names. And so from there, you know, the next thing I would do would be, I'd probably hold on to that. And as I continue to do my information gathering, when I figure out the format for email addresses, or when I figure out the username, now I can generate a list of all that stuff kind of on the fly. And again, usually as a pen tester, I can cheat a little bit, right? So I'm looking for ways to save time. Usually, I almost always have an email address because I have a point of contact that I'm working with, right? So more often than not, I almost always know the format of the email addresses. And so now, if I know that, plus a list of everyone's names, now I can figure out everyone's emails. So let's go through here. So here's just a couple big bash one-liners of like stuff that I might continue to do. So there I could generate first name dot last name, I could generate first initial dot last name, and I could create a list of emails. And again, there's nothing really special about this, right? We're not using any special tools. This is all just kind of Linux command line stuff. And so this is one of the reasons that hackers really like to use Linux, right? If you're pretty good on the command line, it can be extremely flexible and you can get a lot of stuff done. So this is kind of a case for that. Other things, Google Dorks, and this is something that Jason Lang had talked about. I don't know why they're called Google Dorks. I think it's kind of a funny name. But essentially what you're doing is you're just using advanced filters inside Google. And this really isn't a comprehensive list. This is just a list of a couple queries that I like to run. There's 2 links at the bottom there where they kind of have a more comprehensive lists. So we'll see what that looks like. In this case, we're going to kind of put 2 techniques together. So we're going to use a Google Dork to find a document on HighPoint's website, and then we'll download that PDF, and we'll use a tool called EXIF tool to analyze that document's metadata. So in this case, we're kind of putting 2 techniques together. We'll identify a document only through Google, and then we'll take a look at its metadata for information. So here, right on Google, I'll start with site:highpointnetworks.com. And if I just run that as it is, there's nothing really special about that. It's just going to give me the search results for High Point. In that case, it brought up the support portal. So if I run back up to the search bar and I enter the file type filter, now it's going to show me specific PDFs that Google has identified when it was crawling our website. So this can be interesting by itself, depending on what you find for the customer. We're going to look at the document's metadata, but sometimes you'll find interesting documents just by doing that. So here's a document we think is interesting. We'll download a copy of it here. And then we'll jump back over to our command line to analyze its metadata. And for that, we're going to use a tool called exif tool, which again is just another Linux command line tool. And so to basically one argument, you just run exif tool, and then you supply the file that you want to run it against. And I don't know if this thing has a pointer or not, but this is all of the metadata that was inside that Word document. And again, that was inside that PDF document. And there's a couple interesting clues here. I don't know. Oh, yeah. So for example, you can see that even though this is a PDF, it was created with Word for 365. Office 365. So that's going to kind of clue you in that if this was our target organization, they're using Office 365. And if you're kind of thinking about putting some kind of email phishing campaign together, which we often do, it's going to kind of help us to know that they are using Office 365. The other thing we can see is we can see the username of who created that document. We can see that this was made by Brandy, who's our marketing manager. So that's nice there. We got another name. Sometimes that'll actually show you the internal username of the user that created it, and that's better because you can kind of confirm the username scheme that way. So that can be kind of hit or miss. You usually see that on documents that are generated from like an Adobe suite, like Adobe, I can't remember, I think Acrobat, or yeah, whatever's used to generate PDFs. You sometimes see that there. Let's see here. So this was one cool example I just learned about. You can actually protect against that in Office 365. So if we look here, I'm in a Word document, and under the Info tab, they have an Inspect Document button. If you click that and go Inspect Document, leave all the defaults checked and hit Inspect, it'll actually give you a warning, and it says, hey, if you publish this as it is, you're going to give up the creator name, and you're going to give up the document properties, and there's a Remove All button. So I thought that was kind of cool. I didn't realize that that existed. So in that way, you can protect documents that come out of Office 365. So that can help cut down on this a little bit. But remember, that's only Office documents. That's not going to help you with documents that come out of Adobe. So you still want to watch out for that kind of thing there. This is pretty effective when organizations try to create a special username scheme. So sometimes administrators are savvy to this, right? And they know that if your usernames are first name dot last name, well, an attacker can figure that out pretty easily, right? So they'll assign ID numbers or something like that. And that will prevent you from guessing it, right? Or just looking at usernames and figuring it out. But if we can find usernames embedded in documents here, if we can find a couple different usernames, well, then we can put together the scheme pretty quickly. So I thought that was kind of cool. Other things I like to look for, job postings. And this is one example of a job that I saw in Fargo for an IT person. I blocked out the company name, because I don't want to call anyone out here. I just thought that this one was kind of interesting. And looking at the first red arrow, they mentioned Windows Active Directory. And that we probably could have guessed, right? Because almost every organization uses Active Directory. So I go into most projects assuming there's Active Directory, but it's nice to have it confirmed. In the next line down, they mention FortiGate firewalls. So they're using Fortinet firewalls. And they also mention at each campus location. So now I'm thinking there's Fortinet firewalls, there's multiple locations. They might be connected by like a site VPN or something like that. On the next arrow down, they mention software on users' PCs or Macs. So that tells me there's a mixed environment now. And again, from a phishing perspective, that's really interesting, right? any malicious attachments that I generate for PC, those aren't going to work on Mac and vice versa. So now, you might be targeting two different types of users, depending on what their workstation looks like. So that's interesting. Below that, they call out antivirus, IDS, and IPS. And I just thought that that was kind of interesting. So I know certain antivirus vendors, like Symantec, for example, they have a built-in IDS, IPS module bundled right into the AV agent. And so that's kind of what that makes me think of when they called out antivirus, IDS, and IPS all together. I don't know how much to read into that. I thought that that was kind of interesting. Below that, they call out Lansweeper specifically. And so Lansweeper is a network discovery scanner. So that's interesting to know. That tells me that they're actually conducting scans on their network. And so if we were thinking, the pen test would have a physical component where we would sneak in and plug something in, we might not want to do that if they're running scans on their network. They might discover our device. Or on the flip side, that might be a really interesting aspect of the pen test to test. If we plug something in, is it going to be discovered, and how long is it going to take for someone to go unplug it? We could kind of test that process, and that would be really interesting too. And then at the bottom, they call out file servers in each office. So again, confirming this idea that there's multiple locations, and there's hardware at each location. So kind of going back to the physical example, if we think that's in scope for this pen test, maybe it makes more sense to try to sneak into one of the remote offices and see if I can get my hands on that file server. And maybe we even go to the remote office and we say, hey, I'm Jim from headquarters and I need to do some updates to that server. That could kind of be our pretext in this case. So this is just one example. This kind of stuff can be really hit or miss, right? Obviously, not everyone is always hiring for IT people, and they're not always doing that while you're conducting a pen test. So job postings are interesting to look at, but this isn't always going to be like a slam dunk or a gold mine for information. And some job postings aren't all detailed. Sorry, this is making a lot of noise. But I still think this is kind of an interesting thing to look at every once in a while. After that, we'll look at Shodan. Right? Are most of you guys kind of familiar with Shodan, since this is Cybercon, some of you guys? So essentially, Shodan is ran by a guy named John Matherly, and what he's basically doing is scanning everything on the internet and then aggregating his results. And he puts a search bar in front of him here and sells access to it on this website here. And so, saying that out loud, or when you hear that, you might think, well, that sounds really nefarious, or that sounds like a bad idea. But in his case, I think he has good intention. So his argument is that security researchers and professionals like us. Oh, you want me to use this? Yeah.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, I guess we're trading. So yeah, anyway, John's argument for Shodan is that the security researchers, professionals like us, we need something like this to kind of talk about this stuff. And in this way, we kind of assume that bad guys already have access to these sort of tools. If you've ever watched the logs on something you put on the internet, it's pretty obvious to tell that it's getting scanned pretty regularly. So let's kind of take a look here at one query I like to run. So this is just the web page itself. And if I go up in here, I can add some filters. So I'm going to say, show me everything in the United States, show me everything in the state of North Dakota, and show me everything open on port 3389, which is the RDP port, right? And it's a little cut off. It's 626 servers was the number. We look here, and we can see Cal's PC. I thought that was kind of funny, whoever he is. Here's another interesting one. Kind of hard to see again. It shows 5 logged in users on a Windows 7 box. And just by looking at that, we can kind of see the internal login domain and the usernames of 5 users, right? So we've figured out the username scheme and 5 valid usernames. I like the images button though. We can go click that, and then as soon as Shodan loads here, it'll kind of just give you, it'll let you just scroll through all of these RDP interfaces. And I think that that's really kind of interesting. So in this case, 600, that's not so much. If you go to more populated states, you might see a couple thousand. But I think this is kind of interesting to look at. I don't know why it crashed there. So here's another example that I found on that query that I wanted to kind of zoom in on. So you can gather some really interesting information here. Right there, that would be the internal login domain, right? So I blocked that out because we didn't want to call these guys out. So just by looking at this RDP interface here, we learn the internal login domain. We see that there's a user currently logged in, and we can learn their username. So if we were an attacker, like that right there is everything we need to start a brute forcing attack, right? A password guessing attack. And worse yet, right, that account right there, right? That's the built-in Windows administrator account, which doesn't lock by default. So if we are going to brute force an account, like that's the one to go after, because if we get it, it's an admin account. So that's a pretty good case to be in. And this is kind of the exact case that Mike and Deb described earlier this morning when they were talking about the Colorado DOT ransomware attack, right? The attackers got in on an interface similar to this. So being able to look at this through Shodan, I think, is really powerful. And again, remember, we haven't done any port scanning by ourselves, right? Shodan has done all of the port scanning for us. We're just looking at their scan results. So again, kind of hands-off on the target environment, looking through their search results. When I kind of show you guys how to use Shodan with Recon-ng, you do need an API key. To get a Shodan API key, you do need a premium account. Normally, I think they're about $50 for a lifetime account, but they usually do Black Friday deals where they'll sell you one for $5. The last time they did that, I bought two. That's a pretty good deal. For the students, if you sign up on their website with your .edu account, they'll automatically upgrade you to a premium account, and then you can get your API key that way. So that's a pretty good thing to take advantage of for the students, because I think this is a really, really interesting service. There's a lot of cool stuff you can find there. Other places I like to look, right? Weston called it out specifically. Have I Been Pwned is an awesome website. So this is ran by a guy named Troy Hunt. He's a security researcher. He's a Microsoft MVP. You know, Weston kind of talked about he's a little leery to throw his email address into forums like this. I think if you kind of spend some time, read this guy's blogs, I think you'll kind of learn that he's pretty legit. That's kind of my thoughts on it anyway. Basically what Troy does is he gathers up all these data breaches and aggregates them and then puts a search bar on the front of them. So now he kind of does this as a service. You can look and see if you have any records that have been publicly exposed, any passwords. So that's a nice thing to do. That's a nice service to offer for people. Kind of as a pen tester, I'm thinking, well, that's great. And on a pen test, if I gather up a list of emails, well, I think I'll check them against Troy's site and see if they've been in any data breaches that way. And if we find that someone, an employee at our target organization is in the LinkedIn data breach, say, well, now I'll go into that LinkedIn data breach and see if I can recover their credentials for them that way. And that'll happen every once in a while. Troy also keeps track of what are called pastes. Pastes are, just kind of information that get pasted into sites like Pastebin or Ghostbin. And in those cases, pastes usually consist of usernames and passwords in clear text. And I've seen cases where I've taken someone's email address from a target organization, plugged it into here, found that they were in a paste, followed the link to the paste, and got their domain password that way. And that was no password cracking involved. It was just in clear text. So I think this is a really valuable service and a really valuable source of information that way, too. So we'll run through just a really quick example We'll kind of bring it all together with a couple different tools. And we'll kind of perform just a really, really quick reconnaissance exercise on high point networks. And this kind of follows my methodology for using Recon-ng and tying all this stuff together. This isn't all the information that I'm going to gather, but this is usually what I'll do to kind of get started, and then I'll take everything that we gather here, if this was a real pen test, and then I'll kind of go from there. I'll sort of decide what to zoom in on. So the first tool we're going to use is the harvester. It's just a really basic Python script. You point it at a domain, and you get information. So let's kind of see what it looks like here. I'll play this. Yeah. So we call the script by name, we point it at the domain, highpointnetworks.com, and then I'm going to tell it what data sources to query. In this case, I'm going to say Google, Yahoo, and Hunter.io, which is kind of a third-party information gathering service. It does take a little bit to run, and that's it. So pretty straightforward, right? You just run this script, and it kicks out email addresses and hosts. And that happens pretty quick. This definitely doesn't get you everything, though, but this is a pretty good place to start. So the next thing I like to do is I like to take what we get out of the harvester and plug it into a tool called Recon-ng. Recon-ng is meant to be kind of a framework for this sort of stuff, and it's kind of designed to have like the same look and feel as Metasploit. So if you're familiar with Metasploit, using this is a pretty easy transition. It's made by a guy named Tim Tomes. He does a really, really good web app pen testing class. So if you're kind of thinking if you want to brush up on your web app pen testing skills, I would definitely recommend checking out his class. On the right-hand side here, think of Recon-ng kind of as like a database. Every database has a schema and tables, and these are all of kind of the tables inside Recon-ng that we can plug information into. Obviously, there's a lot there, and a lot of valuable information can go in there. For the sake of our quick presentation, these are going to be kind of the 5 tables that we're going to hone in on. And these are kind of where I generally like to start. So domains is pretty straightforward, just company domain. And companies is going to be a company name and a short description. And then after that, we have contacts, first, middle, last name, and email addresses. Hosts, which are just, for the most part, host names and IP addresses, and then ports, right? If we have a bunch of hosts, it would really help us to know what ports those hosts are listening on. And we'll kind of gather all that stuff up with Recon-ng. So the first thing I'm going to do in Recon-ng is I'm going to create a new workspace for our project. Recon-ng has this idea of workspaces where you can have multiple projects going at once. And we're going to import the information that we just gathered from the harvester. So let's see what that looks like. Starting Recon-ng is basically the same as the harvester. So I'm just displaying the files that we got from the harvester. So we have a list of email addresses, and we have a very short list of hosts and IP addresses. And those are going to be what we're going to plug into Recon-ng here. So we start up Recon-ng here, and I'm going to list my workspaces. There's only the default workspace, so I'm going to add a new workspace for our project, and then we'll just start plugging information into it. So the first thing we need to add is our domain, right? We kind of assume that we know a domain, so I'll plug that in. Like I said, I usually cheat a little bit, right? On a pen test, I'm trying to save time, so I almost always know the domain ahead of time, but that's pretty easy to find, right? You can Google a company name, go to their website, and you have their domain. And then here I'm just adding in a really quick description of the company. So if I list our domain, there it is. And if I list our company, you have to spell it right, otherwise it'll throw an error. If I list our company, there it is. So that'll kind of get us started. The next thing we can take a look at are all the different modules that we can use inside Recon-ng. Or I guess we'll take a look at the schema. So again, those are all the different tables inside kind of this database app that we can plug information into. And these are all the different modules that we can use to gather information. So only have an hour here, so we're really just going to kind of scrape the surface on this stuff, but you'll get kind of an idea of how the modules work and what I think are some of the better ones to use. So the first one I'm going to use is this import module. I'm going to import our list of email addresses. I need to tell Recon-ng what table I need to put that into. So I tell it the contacts table, and I need to tell it what column, and that's going to be the emails column. And then I'll run that. And if you ever forget while you're kind of in there, you can run the show schema command again and just have a look at that table if you kind of lose your place. Oh, and I need to tell it the file name. So I'm just listing the files in my directory and then specifying that file. So I'll run that, And now we can see we imported all of our email addresses. So if I just do a quick show contact, I can see that now I have all of these email addresses in my contacts. And now we're going to do the exact same thing for those 3 hosts. And again, I felt like this was going a lot faster when I kind of rehearsed this stuff. So this is kind of the maybe the setup that you need to do for Recon-ng. Once you kind of kickstart Recon-ng with a little bit of information, like a couple email addresses and a couple hosts, then you can really start to, you kind of get the snowball effect where you're just gathering more and more stuff once you've set it up with a little bit of information. So here again, I'm kind of telling Recon-ng where to stick the information. In this case, we're importing both host names and IP addresses. So this is actually a CSV file. And so now we're filling 2 columns in this host table, the host and IP address. And I had incorrectly named it their host name, so I'm going to go correct that. And then if I run this, now we can see we've imported our hosts. And that's really kind of the basic setup for Recon-ng. So now we can use some of our more interesting modules to kind of keep going on that. So, whoops, let's see here. So these are some of the modules I like to use for gathering more contacts. So we're going to use this Bing LinkedIn module that they have. This uses the a Bing search API to actually scrape first names, last names, and profiles out of LinkedIn. And as Jason mentioned earlier, that definitely violates LinkedIn's terms of service. They say that they don't allow any scraping. But on the other hand, it's not tied to an account, and you can't really stop it. If the information's on a web page, then it can be scraped with something. So once we get that big list of names, we'll use the Mangle module to put all those together to form email addresses. And then we'll run all of those newly discovered email addresses through the Have I Been Pwned API. So we saw what the Have I Been Pwned website looks like earlier. But if we were to plug like each email address in there manually, that would take forever, right? So Recon-ng can feed all those in for us automatically. And then we'll use the mail tester module to try to figure out which one of these addresses are valid or not. So this is going to be the LinkedIn module here. There's really not much to configure. You just go into the module and then run it. And it's searching through LinkedIn right now and gathering first names, last names, and all these profiles. So now if we do a show contacts, we're down to like 115 lines here, and it pulled everyone's first name, last name, and LinkedIn profile and plugged it in automatically there for us. So this is a really good way of getting names. This does get kind of off track sometimes, so this will end up, if you kind of open it up and let it rip, it'll grab people's contacts and it'll grab people who aren't necessarily affiliated with your target organization. So the next thing I'm going to use is the Mangle module. Now that we have all these first names and last names, I'd like to put them together to create email addresses. And so I'm going to set the domain there, highpointnetworks.com, and then run this. It's going to take everyone's first name, put a .last name, and then add a @highpointnetworks.com. And now, if we do show contacts again, now it's kicked out this nice list of email addresses for me. So that was kind of a nice, quick way to automate that. So that should give you an idea. So, we went from about having 20 email addresses up front to now we have about 115. So now that we have this nice list, where we might go with that, if we were thinking we wanted to do phishing emails, that might be the next phase in our pen test. We have some more modules that we can use inside Recon-ng. So one I mentioned I like to use is the Have I Been Pwned API. So now we'll take this big list of email addresses and feed it into the Have I Been Pwned website here, and it'll tell us if any of these users have been in any data breaches. And so we run this, and we see that we get some hits back. So in this case, some of these folks have been involved in some data breaches. And this isn't going to show you the password itself, it'll just show you what data breaches these individuals have been involved in. So I look at that, I take note of which users have been in the LinkedIn data breach, for example, and then I'm going to go search for those records inside the LinkedIn data breach. So that's kind of a process I have to take outside of Recon-ng. I don't think I don't know of a good way to kind of integrate the password searching inside of this tool. But now I get a nice list of users that have been in data breaches. So that's helpful for me to know. The other thing that I would like to know is which of these email addresses are valid. And Recon-ng has a module for that as well called Mail Tester. So if I go ahead and run that, it's just going to feed all of these email addresses into this website called Mail Tester, and that kind of checks the mailbox to see if these are valid. I found this website to be kind of flaky. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. And one thing you'll notice here, so it got an error on this specific email address right here. But if we look at kind of where the message came from, that's kind of another clue, right? So we got this message from Mimecast, so that can kind of clue us in that, in this case, they're using Mimecast for email filtering. And if we were thinking about phishing emails, knowing that Mimecast is in place, that might force us to change up our technique a little bit. So again, that's kind of another little clue you can pick up along the way. Let's see here. So those are our contacts. We're up to about just over 100 email addresses now. But what about these hosts? We'd like to have more information on these hosts and more hosts. So these are modules I like to use. Hacker Target is a website that offers scanning services, and they have a free API that you can query for hosts. So we'll use that module. We'll try to brute force host names, and then we'll use the Shodan and IP info databases here. So we'll run this Hacker Target query. Again, there's nothing really to configure here. We just run this, and we get a bunch more host names right here. So in this case, we got about 15 new host names that have all been added to our list. So that's kind of nice. Let's see here. In the next module here, Recon-ng has a big word list of potential host names, right? Things like mail, webmail, remote, VPN, common host names on the internet, and that's configurable right there. And what it's going to do is it's going to take every word in that word list, add a .highpointnetworks.com at the end of it, and just see if that resolves. So in this way, you're just basically brute forcing DNS entries. And it's a really simple concept, but this is pretty effective. I end up discovering a lot of hosts this way. So we can see what this looks like. Again, you can configure the word list if you want to, or you can use the default one. And I have a lot of luck with that. And you can see it's scrolling through a massive amount of records here, and I sped it up. And in this case, we discovered 24 new hosts. So if we show our hosts, now we're up to about 40 some hosts when we started with 3 earlier. So now we're definitely getting an idea of the external presence of this target here, or I guess High Point in this case. Let's see. The next thing I'd like to know is I'd like to geolocate some of these IP addresses. So it would be helpful for me to know where some of these things are physically located, right? If we have that kind of knowledge, now we can kind of think about what servers are hosted by the company itself, what servers are being cloud hosted. That can kind of determine what we want to focus on. If you compromise a web server, but it's hosted in AWS, that's not really going to get you inside the environment. So for that, I'm using the IP info database, which has a free API you can use. And here, you can kind of see it's telling us the location of all of these IP addresses. So now we can kind of see which servers are hosted at remote offices, which servers are hosted at the headquarters, and which servers are cloud services. And again, that's just kind of cluing you in as to where this stuff is, or if I get into one of these, where might that lead me? Let's see here. And then for the last one I like to use Shodan's API. So in this case, now we're going to take all of these IP addresses, or all of these hosts that we discovered, and we're going to run them through the Shodan API. We're going to see if Shodan has any scan results for any of these hosts. And you can see here now Shodan is showing us what open ports that it has found. And again, this is really valuable because now I haven't done any port scanning myself, right? I'm relying on Shodan's port scan results. So I've been hands off on the environment, but now I can kind of get a feel for what ports are open, what ports are maybe commonly associated with login interfaces. If I see things like FTP, SSH, RDP, I'm already thinking to myself, those are maybe interfaces that I might want to try to brute force, or I might want to test authentication on. Shodan, I would say, isn't a replacement for port scanning. Definitely later in the project, when I conduct my own scanning, I've found cases where ports are open that Shodan didn't necessarily know about. So I wouldn't rely on Shodan exclusively. But again, at a glance, as we're gathering information, this can be kind of good information to have. So to kind of wrap it all up, in a relatively short amount of time, right, we gathered just over 100 email addresses, right? I think we ended at about 115, and we gathered information on about 40 or some hosts. So we identified hosts. We have a rough idea of kind of where they are located, and we know open port information. And again, that's kind of a really quick way to gather some quick information. Like I said, that's not all of the information I'm going to gather, but this is like the minimum that I want to know. And now, I would take a look at all this stuff, and I'm either going to start looking inside data breaches, or I might browse to some of those hosts and check them out a little bit more thoroughly. Or I might kind of zoom in on people and try to figure out if we want to do social engineering type stuff. So that's really what I had for you guys. I think we might be a little bit ahead of schedule, but I can take any questions that anyone has, or otherwise we can kind of conclude early as well. Doesn't look like anyone has any questions. No? Cool. Well, thanks for your time. I appreciate everyone kind of staying for the last session of the day. So yeah, thanks for that.